still structures in Latvia that witnessed a forgotten battle.
They're so shattered and splintered, it appears almost as if some vast explosive force has taken them all out in a chain reaction.
A chilling sight that hides a dark World War II secret.
I'm instantly seeing experiments, I'm seeing torture, and I'm seeing horror.
A town in a scorching desert that suffered an extraordinary fate.
Something happened here that thoroughly dismantled these structures and washed away the evidence of human habitation.
And an epic construction project in the mountains of southern Africa that unearthed a deadly material.
The thing that made it such an amazing material also turned it into a killer.
Decaying relics, ruins of lost worlds, forged by years of toil but now haunted by the past. Their amazing secrets are now waiting to be revealed. In a picturesque town north of Berlin, Germany, lie the charred remains of a place with a deeply troubling past.
It's hard to discern what it is. It's a big kind of hangar-like structure. It looks like it was for the production of something important.
It's all very secure, it's gated and cut off. You're wondering why.
It's something that's trying to be discreet. It's on the outside of the town and hidden by tall trees. Whatever it is, it's cloaked in secrecy.
The clues that reveal the dark history of the site are to be found on the inside.
As you come indoors, you see these big halls and spaces, and you've got these massive ovens.
Clearly there was intense heat. Certainly there's evidence of a fire having taken place because of the scorch marks on the walls and ceiling.
When I see old, soulless German engineering rusting away with bricks that have got gas piping in them and taps, and I think the most horrible things about what might have happened here, but what you'd think about this place isn't what happened here. It's a little bit of a different story.
So what did happen here? And why is the building still standing today? The key that unlocks the secret lies less than 2 miles away, at Sachsenhausen concentration camp. It was built by the Nazis during the years leading up to the Second World War. At the beginning of 1937, there were just 21 Jewish prisoners in Sachsenhausen. By 1945, that number had risen to more than 11,000. After the Kristallnacht pogrom of November 1938 alone, 6,000 Jews who had been arrested on the orders of Heinrich Himmler were sent to Sachsenhausen. The Nazi camp system was expanded rapidly after the beginning of World War II, as the regime realized it would need forced labor to maintain war production.
Sachsenhausen is placed on the outskirts of Berlin because it's hoped that the German people won't know too much about its existence.
As the Nazis start to tighten their grip on German political life, more and more people are being pulled off the streets of Berlin and the surrounding cities and locked up in this place.
But the camp was only one part of this terrifying crusade. The now decaying structure nearby also played a key role in the cruel Nazi project. It was a place in which prisoners were forced to work.
You were worked 7 days a week. Your ration was minimal. Now, these weren't specifically death camps, but people were worked close to death.
This was the SS Bakery, a place built to feed their captors. A As local expert Horst Sefferens tells us, working here was simply another form of torture.
Diese großen Öfen oder die Reste davon, die wir hier sehen, haben Tag für Tag Tausende von Broten produziert. Und das Häftlingskommando, das hier in der Bäckerei Zwangsarbeit leisten musste, war es natürlich wahrscheinlich eine Qual, ansehen zu müssen, dass hier in Hülle und Fülle Nahrungsmittel produziert wurden, während sie selber und ihre Mithäftlinge im Lager furchtbaren Hunger leiden mussten.
It's a dreadful irony that the bakery might also have been one of the few places to offer a glimmer of hope. But the dangers were great.
Prisoners in German concentration camps were systematically starved, so even some crusts that had fallen off of bread in those industrial ovens might mean the difference for them between life and death.
You might think that, oh, if you took the end of the loaf that they were going to lop off anyway, or a crust that fell on the floor, it would be no big deal. But of course it was a big deal. The Germans were big on insisting on obedience. You'd be mercilessly beaten.
Despite the perils, a former prisoner remembers that for some, their desperate circumstances left little choice.
Brotlaibe selber ins Lager hineingeschmuggelt haben, indem sie Brotlaibe der Länge nach halbiert haben und dann mit Schnüren um ihre Waden herumgebunden haben, sodass sie von den weiten Hosenbeinen bedeckt waren und sie sie auf die Art und Weise in das Lager mitnehmen konnten. Natürlich war das sehr gefährlich.
The cruelty and inhumane conditions here were shocking. But Sachsenhausen had another grim purpose. The SS, one of Hitler's most feared organizations, used it as a testing ground.
Wir befinden uns jetzt im zweiten Obergeschoss des sogenannten Turms A, des zentralen Wachturms, durch den auch die Häftlinge des Häftlingslagers trafen. Ein Maschinengewehr praktiziert, mit zwei Wachen, die hier Tag und Nacht standen, und zum Modellcharakter von Sachsenhausen gehörte, dass die Wachmänner, die hier rumstehen, das gesamte Häftlingslager von diesem zentralen Punkt aus kontrollieren können.
Sachsenhausen was the first of its kind, the dark template for future concentration and death camps. While other sites used a rectangular model rather than this triangular shape, the key feature was obvious in both. It provided clear lines of sight to prevent escape.
You would be gunned down, either by that guard at the apex or in the guard towers scattered around the facility. There was a need that people wouldn't escape because their labor was needed, but also they didn't want people to escape and spread the word of what was going on inside these camps.
The concept had a psychological effect as well. Wherever the prisoners moved in the camp, this watchtower was to be seen from everywhere. They basically looked directly into the hole of this machine gun, symbolically expressing the total power of the SS.
Zum Ausdruck kam.
As the prototype camp, this place played another vital role during the early years of the Nazi regime.
In the mid-30s, the Nazis were just starting to figure out how to build a concentration camp. The Nazis are hiring ordinary police officers, and they're hiring ordinary tradesmen, and Sachsenhausen is the place where an ordinary German can be turned into an SS killer.
Helping to feed this dreadful system was the bakery. And its success meant that the next chapter in its tragic story would soon begin.
When World War II begins in 1939 and Germany massively mobilized, calls all the reserves, expands conscription, you suddenly have a need for bread, to feed all the big garrison around Berlin.
At the beginning, production is moderate. We're talking 10,000 loaves a day. Later on, you're talking of a much greater expansion of 4 to 5 times of the original factory output.
Everything here was soon replicated at sites all across the German Reich. The Nazis had made a success of slavery. So that too was increased and expanded on a horrifying scale.
Because this is one of the early attempts to set up a large SS industrial enterprise, This is used as a model for other large SS facilities. By the middle of World War II, the SS is one of the largest industrial operations in the Third Reich.
Forced labor became a key element of the Nazi war machine. The infamous slogan on the gate, "Work sets you free," was very far from the truth.
Tatsächlich hatte
In fact,
natürlich Arbeit
working
in
in a concentration camp
Konzentrationslager eine
had
ganz
a
andere
completely
Funktion.
different function.
Arbeit
Work
war
here
immer
had
auch
always been an
ein
instrument
Instrument,
to abuse,
Häftlinge zu
torture,
misshandeln, zu
and
quälen,
even
zu
put
foltern,
prisoners to
auch zu
death.
Tode zu bringen.
Of course,
Und
that
dies
slogan
verschleiert
was used to
dieser Begriff
conceal the
natürlich
reality.
Vollkommen.
But in a final twist of fate, the bakery that had helped feed the vicious SS regime turned out to be a lifeline for those few inmates fortunate enough to see the end of the war. It came with the liberation of the camps by the Soviets.
The Soviets behind this bread factory, and they pressed it into service to feed their own troops, to feed the 3,000 or so surviving inmates. And for these camp inmates, it must have been fantastic because they'd been looking hungrily at these thousands of loaves of bread made every day, and suddenly they have the opportunity to eat them.
The fact that people remained alive in this concentration camp was almost miraculous. The fact that there was a bakery nearby that could feed them was a blessing.
With its darkest years now behind it, the bakery remained in use until the 1990s when it was devastated by a fire. But as the years of horror recede further from memory, today the two sites are as important as ever.
Bezeugen, dass
They
es
testify
diese
the very
Lager
existence
gab,
of
dass
these
es diese
camps
Verbrechen
and
gab
crimes.
und dass man sie nicht
And that cannot be denied.
abstreiten und leugnen kann. Und
We
wir
think that
denken,
these
dass diese
architectural witnesses
baulichen
will be all the more
Zeugnisse
important
der
in the
Lager
future.
auch in Zukunft eine umso größere Bedeutung
Because the
gewinnen
people
werden,
who once survived
weil
the
die
terror of
Menschen,
the SS
die
in these
Terror der
camps
SS in diesen Lagern überlebt haben,
will soon
bald
no
nicht
longer
mehr
be
unter
amongst
uns
us.
sein werden.
In the arid plains of Nevada, USA, miles from any signs of civilization, are the dusty remains of a crumbling site.
This is a harsh place to live. It's in the middle of the desert. The sun is beating down on it, but it's not clear what exactly would have caused such devastation.
Everything is almost completely dismantled, kind of like what you see in a very ancient ruin. But when you look more closely, you can see it's not actually that old. You can see signs of concrete.
Something's swept through here. Something's happened to take away the structure.
A closer inspection of the strange features here begins to reveal the bizarre chain of events that contributed to its downfall.
We're looking for clues, and one of the details that stands out is the tree trunks, just all kind of cut off. Another detail is that everything's incredibly weathered. There's no sharp edges, there's no right angles here. Everything's been rounded off.
What's really strange is that you're in the middle of the desert, but there are shells, which might actually be the clue that describes exactly what happened here.
It's really hot out here. We're in the Mojave Desert, and temperatures can get up to 115 degrees in the summer. The most important thing being out here is to have a lot of water with you.
As an archaeologist with the National Park Service, Erin Eichenberg has made extensive studies of the land around the ruins. And she thinks that despite the searing heat, the attractions of the site were clear.
This is a pretty inhospitable place to live, but because we're near the confluence of the Virgin and the Muddy River here, people were able to make it work and lived here for over 70 years.
Based around agriculture, the settlement here once blossomed. But the seeds of its destruction were actually sown in the mid-19th century, when a group of Mormons arrived, hoping to establish a town here.
When the first settlers arrived here in 1865, this was the middle of nowhere in the middle of nowhere. They thought they were still within the boundaries of Utah, but it turned out they'd moved into Nevada.
And when the tax inspector turned up and informed them that they weren't in Utah, they actually decided to move on and burnt the town to the ground. So what we see here today is the next stage of this town. This is the following story.
So the early settlers left this place a burnt-out ruin. But it would eventually see a second destructive event, and this time the cause could hardly have been more different. This is the ghost town of St. Thomas.
So after the Mormons moved out, other settlers moved in. They started farms, they built a village, and they were able to establish a pretty self-sufficient community.
They were pretty remote in the desert, but they had everything they needed. They had built a really nice life for themselves. They didn't need for anything.
But while St. Thomas began life as a hidden secret deep in the desert, the evidence here of an old rail track on the edge of town explains why it didn't remain secret for very long.
At the beginning of the 20th century, the world is getting smaller. America's turning a corner at this point. Railways are spreading across, the population is growing, opportunity is out there. And this brings, great hope for the people living here.
In the beginning, at least, modernity brought prosperity. Once the railroad arrived, the highways soon followed.
We're on Main Street of St. Thomas, and as you can see, it's a big, wide road, enough for horse and carriage and later automobiles. St. Thomas was one of the stopping points along Los Angeles to Salt Lake City. And so on the other side of these stumps, we'd have buildings and businesses that would have supported the tourists that were coming into town, not just the people that lived here at St. Thomas.
The town was spread out over almost 200 acres. It had everything: stores, garages. It even had an ice cream parlor. Surrounding all this was beautiful farmland where fields of wheat, cotton, and other fresh produce grew. At its height, around 500 people lived here. Life was good, and so, it seemed, were the prospects for the town.
St. Thomas is an established community at this point. It has a school, it has a graveyard, it's about the past and the future. And then suddenly, that's all about to change.
Walking through the barren streets today gives us a sense of what life was once like here. But there are also hints about what caused its demise.
These shells aren't something you normally find in the desert. You normally find them near the ocean. But these shells are found all over the site here, so it's actually a clue to what happened to this town.
One of the key things to surviving in the desert is water. But it was actually water that led to the downfall of this settlement.
A dramatic transformation was about to take place. The dry and dusty streets of St. Thomas were swallowed up by a flood of biblical proportions.
The rising waters reached St. Thomas in 1938 and filled the streets and covered the buildings, and ultimately it reached a height of 60 feet above where the town had been.
The desert town of St. Thomas was no more.
It must have been a really bizarre thing to watch, because here you are in the middle of the desert and suddenly you're being flooded by water.
Perhaps the disaster came as little surprise to the town's citizens. After all, they'd had years of warnings. In the 1920s, plans for one of the most ambitious construction projects of the 20th century had been announced: the Hoover Dam.
We're in Lake Mead, Nevada. We're near Hoover Dam at the bottom end of the lake. It stretches 85 miles today to the upper end where the Colorado River dumps in.
Local resident Christopher Hensner has been navigating these waters for 40 years.
When they dammed Hoover Dam, of course, it filled up the lake and basically covered the mountains and the valleys. Right now, we're pushing 400, 450 feet deep. The lake contains approximately 200,000 to 300,000 acres of covered water.
Work began in 1931. The plan was to build the world's tallest dam.
The idea behind Hoover Dam was to harness the power of the Colorado River. They would use it to make electricity. They would also use the water for irrigation. They would make the desert bloom.
The Hoover Dam project was going to benefit so many people in different states, but it came at a very high price to some.
For the people of St. Thomas, this was a disaster on a very personal level. Their homes were going to be literally washed away. Ancestors, their history, their stories, just covered up by feet of water.
Trees were cut down. Anything salvageable was removed from the town. And as the waters rose, the last inhabitants rowed away from their homes. But if this town was lost to the deep, why are its streets today filled with sand and not water? The answer is revealed by the watermarks on the cliffs.
100% full is the top of the white line. And today we're at 42% full, 129 feet below that line. The last time it was full at the top of the watermark was in 2000. Since then, it's been in a steady decline.
Years of drought and increasing demand for water have put enormous pressure on the supply. As a result, the waters here have receded and St. Thomas is exposed once again. St. Thomas may have risen again, but it gives us a stark reminder of the pressing need to regulate water usage in an ever-expanding modern world.
The bottom line, there's not enough water. It's a finite supply. It's going to require conservation on the people's part. Today, water's the most valuable resource in the desert. It's the new gold.
In Latvia, in Eastern Europe, is a dilapidated set of ruins which are falling into the sea.
It's very strange, you know, you arrive here on the Baltic coast of Latvia, beautiful and very natural, and then you see this objects littered around the beach that look almost like UFOs that have just kind of dropped onto the beach, these big wheels and slabs of concrete.
Here you see large concrete buildings, and they have broken in half. It looks as if it's been struck by a major catastrophe.
Whatever this was, they spent heavily and extensively to build something vast.
Strange towers, overgrown bunkers, and other fortifications are found nearby. But there's more still.
Further inland, there are an entirely different style of buildings with very different architecture, much more ornate, but they're also crumbling, also destroyed. With this level of destruction across both sites, clearly something went very horribly wrong here.
100 years ago, a bitter and bloody battle took place here. But all records of it were somehow erased from history. Finally, now, the ruins here are beginning to give up their forgotten secrets. At the end of the 19th century, this stretch of coastline in modern-day Latvia sat on the fringes of the Russian Empire. These structures were built with the challenges of an ever-changing world very much in mind.
1890, the old alliance, Russia is starting to fall apart, and the Russians are clearly looking at the Germans as likely future enemies.
The Russian Empire is completely reorienting itself strategically. So you see a complete focus on defending the Baltic Sea.
The Russian Tsar chose the port of Lapaya for the new defensive constructions. They were supposed to counter an ever-growing German threat. However, time would prove them to be a grave mistake. Local expert Christus Crafts has explored every inch of this site. It seemed, on the surface at least, to offer a formidable position for artillery defenses.
What we see here is a small part of the fortifications built here along the coast. This is battery number 1. There are 8 on the coast. This cannon right here, it would be on a platform but rotates left to right, and it could shoot in any direction at any ships coming on.
The prime position also meant that a huge force would need to be stationed here to man the guns that would be trained upon the waters to the west.
The aim was to create the mother of all coastal defenses that no one in their right mind would ever attack.
These are the northern forts of Korosta, the Russian naval warport of the city of Lipan. But this was only one section of a much larger system of defenses against the inevitable German attack.
You see the creation of a big breakwater that juts a mile into the sea. That was created so that you could then shelter big warships behind it. And then all of these forts ran out by the breakwater and then all along the beach so that no enemy fleet could come in, get close enough to bombard the port, to blockade the port, to try to attack the port.
From here, the defensive lines then ran inland.
The Tsar's aim was to turn the port into a fortified city. The area was vast, 14 or 15 square miles, with coastal defenses on the seafront and on the rest, walls and moats, all of it protected by some of the most powerful weaponry that he had access to.
At the heart of this grand fortress complex was everything needed to keep the port operating and the walls defended.
This fortification system was huge, protecting the naval base, harbor of Liepāja, which would station more than 100 warships, some 20,000 soldiers. There would be housing for them all, gunpowder storage, laboratories, training centers, shipbuilding factories, and so on and on.
But not everything about Korosta was perfect.
The main attraction of the site was that the port was ice-free all year round. The danger, though, and the vulnerability, even though it's one of the reasons for its existence, was its proximity to Germany.
The fundamental problem with this is only about 50 miles from the closest German port at Memel. You are right on the front lines if a war occurs. And you don't want to risk too much of your fleet right on the front lines.
Korosta took 13 long years to build. But by the time it was completed in 1906, it wasn't only its location that was giving cause for concern.
Basically, this place was no longer up to the job it was supposed to do. Military technologies advanced very fast, faster than anything else, and therefore there was no chance that this fortification could stand any longer.
Because it was built without any metal reinforcement, larger, more destructive artillery shells could now easily penetrate the defenses. So, after just 2 years of use, it was suddenly abandoned.
When they rethought their strategy and they realized that this was not going to work, this is reduced to a relatively unimportant military installation by the time World War I begins.
Having decided to abandon the northern forts, the Russians tried unsuccessfully to dismantle them. So, they were simply left deserted.
I think eventually, had the Tsar kept this fortress, World War I would have destroyed it anyway. I don't think there is a chance that this would have helped the Russians if they kept this. However, that was not the end of the story for this fortress.
Within a few years, it would be the scene of a bitter battle that is largely forgotten by the history books. The story began in 1915 during World War I, when German forces stormed through Liepāja, capturing the city and the fortifications. But the Russian Empire was soon facing far greater problems.
This period was the beginning of the end of the Russian Empire. The vast losses sustained in the war and the Tsar's inability to manage the war effort led to sweeping changes back home and the Russian Revolution.
The final German defeat in the First World War came in 1918. Soon after, Latvia decided to strike out for independence. This movement began in the capital Riga, but the battle soon came to the old fortress of Liepāja, and here, to the Redan fort.
This little Latvian army, it's fighting this kind of triangular conflict against the Soviets on the one front and these German troops coming out of Germany.
So Latvian army knew that the Germans are coming, and they had to get ready for an attack. But the thing is, there were only about 50 of them here. There would have to be at least 100, 200 men to properly protect this fort. There should be at least 10 cannons on this fort. They had none. It was a desperate situation, to be honest.
With the odds now heavily stacked against them, the Latvian army was forced to retreat. The Germans duly took the fort, but many German troops were quickly moved on, presenting the Latvian fighters with a great opportunity.
So they knew if they retake this fort, they might just manage to get rid of Germans altogether. Only way to get in here is that bridge. And probably there's German artillery, probably they're still outnumbered, they just didn't know that. They had to take their chances, use the elements of surprise and just storm in here. And that's what they did. Not without losses, but they managed to take this fort.
A year after the World War I armistice was signed, the fighting across Liepāja brought an historic chapter to a close.
The Latvians win, Germans withdraw, and the last act of World War I is actually finished. The last battle is actually Liepāja.
Ultimately, it was not only war that caused the damage here. Time, neglect, and nature have also been great forces of destruction.
In the end, it's 100 years of erosion that has destroyed these forts. The ground has been ripped away from under them by the sea, and now they are simply crumbling into the water.
Unfortunately for Latvia, independence was short-lived. The country was forced under Soviet rule for much of the 20th century, and the brief story of its independence was simply stricken from the record. As a result, these structures have assumed an even greater importance today.
This part of history was completely wiped out, completely rewritten. And people were afraid to talk about it with their children, in the fear of being deported for just mentioning these things. And now we want to remember all these things to make them known for our people.
"200 miles east of Johannesburg, South Africa's biggest city, is dramatic mountainous countryside.
This desolate landscape is border region. This is the mountain range between Swaziland and South Africa, and there is nothing here apart from nature.
The mountains are craggy, it's remote, it's difficult to access. So if you want to be there, there has to be a pretty good reason.
But if you look very, very carefully, tucked away in places, mankind has left its mark. And it's not just planting a flag.
Dotted along the valley is surprising evidence of human engineering.
All of a sudden, this incredible construction comes into view.
But we have these pylons. We have these tall, thin lattice towers supporting a cableway. Just a few places, you can actually see the remains of some form of carriage.
There are objects hanging from the cables, cars for holding something, but where were they coming from and where were they going to?
At one end, the cables lead up to a sprawling mountaintop site. Amongst the battered buildings and rusting machinery hang numerous eerie carriages.
When humanity makes its mark on the planet, we always do it for a reason. And here, it's just hard to make that out. It doesn't look like a leisure setup. It doesn't look like a military installation.
Whatever it was that merited this incredible effort of construction has to lie at the end of this cable line. But if it was so valuable, Why was it abandoned, and why does this machinery now stand still on the landscape?
In the late 19th century, gold and diamond prospectors struck lucky across southern Africa. Their impact was sudden and dramatic.
The discovery of gold and diamonds changed everything, especially in the interior of South Africa, which was very sparsely populated, mostly by various indigenous African groups. All of a sudden, you have Europeans flooding into the interior to exploit this new resource. They're going to build mines, they're going to build railroad lines, and the population of the entire region is going to boom as a result.
Saloon bars, music halls, and hotels sprung up to service the swelling population of the new boomtown of Barberton. Unfortunately, the gold rush here was short-lived, and prospectors soon left Barberton to search for gold elsewhere. But the few diggers left behind then began to unearth a very strange substance.
The miners were looking for telltale signs of gold, but they found something else, this white fibrous material. It would be another quarter century before they realized just how important this strange fiber would be, and their lives would be changed forever.
This previously unknown material would bring yet more fortune to the region, but it came at a deadly price. It was mined by the Havelock Gold Mining and Exploration Company.
Havelock Mine had one of the wonder materials of the 20th century, just sitting there underground, waiting to be extracted.
The mysterious, fibrous material that for decades miners had simply cast aside was asbestos.
The actual asbestos is up the top of the mountain. It can be extracted quite easily, but getting it to a point where you could transport it, it's 20 kilometres away. Water's not an option for transportation. Roads are very, very difficult. So they had to think in an imaginative way, and boy, did they.
There are 52 towers supporting the steel ropeway, and the overall distance is 20 kilometres. When it was built, it was the longest cableway outside Europe. On a normal working day, 2,500 bags, that's about 120 tons of asbestos fibre, make this journey to the outside world. What a lovely way to go.
Exploring this sprawling site is local expert Tony Farrar.
The purpose was to transport asbestos to the railhead here in Barberton and coal back to Havelock Mine to power the generators. A critical aspect of the cableway was that you had to balance the goods coming out, which was asbestos, and the coal going back had to be exactly equal.
Once you start using your imagination and you get your engineering brain in the game, this is the obvious solution. Pylons, nice, lightweight, you can carry them up the mountain, bolt them all together, get them going, and then the cableway, string that up, and suddenly you have this moving roundabout.
The materials were carried in cradles or cocoa pans around the 13-mile loop.
The whole cableway is about 52 pylons, and it would take a single cocoa pan 2 hours to do the trip. Behind me are the big sheds where the asbestos was stored. It all arrived in 50-kilogram bags and was exported by rail truck to Johannesburg.
From Johannesburg, asbestos was exported worldwide as demand exploded. Insulation for homes and electric wiring, cement, brake pads, precast panels for buildings. Its uses were many and varied.
30,000 to 40,000 tons of asbestos were shipped out around the world every single year.
For decades, the mine was the largest single employer in Swaziland. Its thousands of workers lived in the small nearby town of Bulembu. They had no idea what fate had in store for them.
No one really knew the deadly nature of this material, least of all the people who were mining it at the time.
Asbestos, the very, very fine fibres, the thing that made it such an amazing material, also turn it into a killer.
Asbestos contains microscopic fibres that get into the lungs and cause cancer and other really deadly ailments. So the miners were not only being paid very low, but they were also paying with their health and their lives to keep this industry going.
In fact, the dangers of asbestos had been known for some time. But by the 1960s, the evidence could no longer be ignored.
Asbestos-producing companies have long suppressed the dangers of this material. The knowledge that microscopic fibers could get into people's lungs and cause cancer, and that was just the people who were around asbestos. You can imagine how dangerous it was for the workers.
As public awareness about the dangers of asbestos increased, Turner & Newell, the British company that operated the mine, was hit by a wave of compensation claims. Even as one of the largest asbestos companies in the world, they couldn't cope.
And suddenly, this amazing boom town had no purpose. The population went from 10,000 to about 600 people almost overnight. And today, when we look around, this is what we see. We see the legacy of a huge-scale mining operation with no purpose anymore.
After the mine finally closed in 2001, Turner & Newell entered voluntary bankruptcy to avoid compensating the remaining miners and their families. It also absolved them of their responsibility for paying to clean up the mine, so leaving the hazardous fibers blowing in the wind. But happily, Barberton has been given a new life away from gold and asbestos. Some of the oldest and best preserved rocks, dating back millions of years, have been discovered there, and they are providing an invaluable window into how the Earth evolved into a green planet able to support life.
Barberton, born out of gold, but now its future is in the scientific value of these rocks. They were laid down at the time that life began, and there's no bigger question in science than how and where did life begin, and that is Barberton's future. It's the scientific value attracting visitors from all over the world.
These scientific studies are promising a very different and brighter future for this region, a future based on tourism. Now they are abandoned, crumbling ruins. Many remind us of dark times, but some were once beacons of hope and progress, lasting testimonies to human imagination, enterprise, and spirit.